afternoon. First, I apologize for not speaking in Spanish. I do speak Spanish, but it's gotten a little bit difficult to do so and to discuss topics like these. So I'll be speaking to you in English today. And we're going to be talking about power. We're going to be talking about power, specifically women's power. So let's start with an introduction. We're going to be talking about why we should make our media matter in terms of social change, why story is an element of power. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you who I am. So I come from New York. I'm a New Yorker. That's why I talk so fast. Not as fast as Daniel did this morning, I hope. But I do. I speak like a New Yorker. And I used to be a lawyer. I used to be an attorney. And then I realized that being an attorney, being a lawyer, wasn't really satisfying me. I needed to work on social justice issues. I needed to work on human rights. And I wasn't getting that as a lawyer. So I ended up going into human rights. I basically apprenticed myself to two different women. One was named Joyce Horman. She is the widow of a man named Charles Horman, who was one of two Americans who was assassinated in the stadium in Santiago on September 11th, 1973, by Pinochet's forces. And she started an organization called the Charles Horman Truth Project to work on issues of accountability and universal jurisdiction. And she did it through the lens of being a wife who was left without her husband and someone who was left without her family. And the second person that I apprenticed myself to was a woman named Michaela Walsh. And she was one of the architects in the 1960s of the concept of microfinance, specifically microfinance for women's economic opportunity. So that was those were my first two projects in getting into human rights and into international development issues. And then I became the executive director of a couple of different nonprofits, all aimed at development and rights, specifically for women and children. I am now a more generalist. I work on human rights and international development, not just for women, but because we often, around the world, whether it's in the United States, in Argentina, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, we often lack structural power, right? We may have personal power, we may have other forms, but what we don't have is political power, often financial power, right? Bureaucratic power, because we're left out of those tables. So even though I'm a generalist, even though I work on issues of human rights generally, most often the people who are most affected by human rights violations or by development issues are women. So that's a through line in my work. What I do now is I run a company. I founded a company 10 years ago called the Creative Impact and Experience Lab, CIEL. And what we do is we work on cultural innovation, meaning we're using culture, technology, and storytelling as our building blocks, as our drivers of social change in human rights and in development. So I like to get a little bit of theory behind us before we go into actual case studies. So this is, I start with a supposition. This is the grounding for my work. I think that culture and storytelling, like cultural expression, are the connective tissue that binds us together as humans. It's not data, it's not law, even though law is essential. It's really our stories. It's the way we really relate to each other and how we express ourselves to each other. And from that, I have a framework which I call either power of narrative or narrative power. All right. The power of narrative, what that means is that story itself, story is a building block, it's an engine of change. There is a power inherent in story that you can't get from anything else, and it becomes a driver of change. Narrative power, they're aligned concepts. Narrative power is what I just talked about. It's the ability to use your own story to claim your own power. So when we think about the question of power, often, as I said, we're talking about financial power or political power like elected officials or people who are heading NGOs or corporations. But when you own your own story, and when you know how to use your own story, you have another source of power. So what I'm looking at is creative media and cultural expression as having the power to contextualize human need, opportunity, and experience to catalyze social change. So why is this important? Why should we think about the power of story, particularly in terms of women? One is that we get to tell a story together, right? When we start telling each other stories, we start connecting each other. We're able to identify with each other and relate to each other, and we're able to understand what we're each going through. And then you can tell a story of complexity, right? Data is not going to tell you the complexity of an issue. It's not going to tell you what people are actually experiencing. And every social issue, whether it's migration or refugee rights, climate change, water, political conflict, these are complex issues. There's nothing that is simple, that only has one solution or one problem. Everything intersects. So when you use story, you can pull out all of those points in a way that nothing else can. You can tell a story based on your own lived experience, right? So you can say, this is what's happening to me, or this is what I've seen happening to someone in that village, in that town, in that university, in that situation, whatever it is. You can then drive and assess qualitative impact. I'm not going to talk about that too much today because it's very dry, but it's about, you can use your story to then assess your situation and assess your solutions, and then you can harness and spread power. So the process that I use is this. It looks like a linear process. It's not a linear process. The basis of our work is this line, though. We start with awareness. Often when people are using story, whether it's film or immersive media or anything like that, what they're saying is that we want to raise awareness of an issue, right? That's their end goal. But that doesn't actually make change, right? So what we're looking at is awareness is your first step. So you want people to be aware of what's happening, but then you have to engage them. You have to engage them. I'm sure you've heard the concept of engagement. You're engaging audiences into a particular issue, into a particular solution, and you're doing that using stories and creating an ecosystem of stories, right? That's the concept of transmedia, making sure that you're creating multiple stories that are spread over a number of different platforms. Then you get to action, and then change happens. So awareness is only the first point. And what we do in our work, particularly as storytellers, is we're working on the engagement part. We're partnering with NGOs and activists to do the action part. And together we can make change. So when I said I apprenticed myself to these two women, Joyce Horman and Michaela Walsh, that's when I started learning both the constructs of human rights defense and international development. This was where I learned storytelling. So I was the executive director of an organization called Kids with Cameras, which was aligned with and had the movie Born into Brothels, which won the Academy Award, the Oscar, in 2005. It's a long time ago, for Best Documentary. And this is a story about 9 children who are the children of sex workers in a brothel in Calcutta. And they meet a photographer, a Western photographer, and they learn how to photograph their situation, their surroundings, and it changes the way they think about themselves. It sort of changes the way they think about their situation. And it was really about the power of image and the power of their own stories in helping them change the way they thought about themselves. The film itself became a huge, it did win the Oscar, so it got a lot of profile. But it told me the first time that you could use image and film and story in a way to catalyze change in a way I hadn't seen before. And so that's when I realized that story and image are going to be crucial to the work that I do. So fast forward a few years, about 7 years, in 2012 there was a film called Inocente, which also won an Oscar for short documentary. Which is about a young woman who at that point was 15 or 16, I believe, or 14 or 15, who is in California. She's homeless, undocumented, and an artist. At a time when California, the state, was thinking about defunding arts programs. So because she was homeless and because she's undocumented, when I say undocumented, do you know what that means? It basically, we have, our immigration policies in the United States are terrible right now. But it means that people who sort of lack immigration status and don't have proof about it. So she was all three. These are the three factors. And these are the three factors that we started working on. I worked with the nonprofit and the filmmakers to think through the social impact strategy around how to use this film to work on the issues of child homelessness, the lack of documentation, and on arts programs, and the importance of arts programs for children who are homeless as a safe space. Do you want to show the trailer?
This is kind of weird. Okay. Dear people of the world. Just because I'm homeless doesn't mean I don't have a life, because I do have a life. I'm a girl who likes to jump in puddles and likes flowers. When I paint, I feel happy, so it's a good way to start my mornings. Just paint on something. And what better place than my face?
Every student is to present today.
Kids at my school don't know that I'm homeless. If people would find out, they'd probably make fun of me. Not having a home is like not having somewhere safe to go to.
La tomé del brazo y le dije, vente, vámonos para aquel puente que está allá y nos vamos a aventar al mar, tú y yo. No te quiero escuchar llorar.
And I'm still waiting for that one day that will change my life. I think my life depends on me being an artist. I think if I don't become an artist, I'd probably not just let everyone down, but mostly let myself down. And although people think they know me, they know nothing of my life. The woman's belly I came out of will never know what I go through out of her sight.
Living together right now is not working. There's lots of stress.
Quisiera abrazarla, darle los besos que dejé de darle desde que tenía 6 años.
This is her first opportunity to prove to herself that she's on the right path in life and to show the world who she is and where she's come from.
I don't know if I'm strong or whatever, but I think it's about time that I go my own way.
So as you can see, the film is beautiful, and I think it's on Netflix, or you can find it on YouTube as well. It's a very colorful film, as you can see. The entire film sort of mirrors Inocente, the young woman. She is extremely colorful. Her art is extremely colorful, and the entire film sort of affirms that in a way. And what we were looking at was her joy. Right? Even though she's undocumented, homeless, and there was a real streak of sadness in her, there's a joyfulness to the way she expresses herself. And harnessing that was a beautiful way to think about how we work with, particularly with young women, on their self-expression to help them supersede their situation. She herself, she turned 16 and she emancipated herself from her mother. She was able to she was no longer homeless, she found her own home, and now she's a working artist, which is really beautiful. And she was on stage to accept the Oscar for the film, which was beautiful. But also what we did was we ended up working with, I helped the filmmakers do a curriculum and a discussion guide and do a sort of a social impact strategy that allowed us to work on educational assets to help think through access to arts education, lack of documentation, and homelessness. And I will say that in the United States, the last time I checked 2 years ago, the statistics on child homelessness were that 1 in 30 children is homeless, which is massive, right? So, you can only do as much as you can. The second project I want to talk to you about is actually not necessarily only about women. It's a movie called Is Dayani Cristal. It is about a man who was found dead on the US side of the US-Mexico border in Arizona. And the entire film and the entire project is about border death on the US-Mexico border. So almost about a third of the work that we do in my company touches on migration or refugee rights around the world, and particularly around what's happening on the US-Mexico border, increasingly so. And so the movie is about a man from Honduras who is found dead 20 minutes by car from Tucson, Arizona. And his death, he was found with a tattoo on his chest that said Dayani Cristal. And so that becomes a clue to his identity. And the film is about, which you can find it on Vimeo. The film is about the quest to identify and repatriate his body. It's also about the journey that he probably took, which is being taken by men and women both, but primarily in this case it's a man, but also the family that he left behind. And the disproportionate effects of migration, climate change, violence, and lack of opportunity that's being felt by families, and particularly mothers, in Central America. So this was a multi-platform. This was a sort of a transmedia or multiple platform project. So there's a film that was the tent pole. Then we did an interactive ebook. We did posters and murals and original art. We did an interactive website that talks about the systemic issues related to migration in North and Central America and the Western Hemisphere, and why people are leaving, what's happening on the journey. And it was all derived from the narrative of the film. So we worked on 6 different issues. And if you click on these, you can get, what we did was we did films, short films, images, essays, links, data, all of that. That is all free for people in the movement to use. So it's all open sourced. So anybody who's working on migration issues can pull anything that we do from this site. And then we did something that we called Border Stories, which was a community-facing effort, so that if you saw the movie or if you had a missing, a relative that was missing and you wanted to reflect back, you could record your story. It was written. And then specifically around women, we helped produce a mural in the middle of Phoenix, like in the middle of downtown Phoenix, as a tribute to mothers of the disappeared. And it's along a highway, and it was sort of a political victory because they didn't actually want us to put it up there. And so this was done by 4 artists, 4 muralists, 2 from Mexico and 2 from the United States, and it's tribute to them. We also ended up supporting the mothers, the Caravan of Mothers. So there's a caravan that goes every year from Central America to the US-Mexico border. So we worked with them, and we worked with the community in, it's a little town called El Escanito, which is where the main character, the man who died, came from. And we worked with them on access to water, education, and helping, sort of talking to mothers whose children were in danger of migrating. So that was an entire thing. Can you show, yeah. And there was a set of films that you can watch called Los Invisibles. This was co-produced by Gael Garcia Bernal. So there was 4 short films that they did with, go ahead and watch it.
Six out of 10, second part. We are all single mothers. The father left me. her husband died, her husband died too, and my husband is the same as if he were dead because he doesn't help us at all. I left my family, my kids, my mother. How many kids do you have? 2. I left everything I have. I hope to get to the United States to help them because at home things are very difficult. We have lots of expenses and we don't have enough work. What are you afraid of as you face this journey? We are afraid of being arrested because we cannot pay for the fine. We don't have money.
So this is part of a film series called Los Invisibles, which is part of the whole the Who Is Dayani Cristal transmedia effort, and you can find that on YouTube for free as well. And if you're working in migration, you can use those. Those films were made in 2010, so 8 years ago, but the issues are the same and they're getting worse, right? So it's about the journey, and this entire effort is all sort of scaffolded, supported by the stories of migrants themselves, right? So the entire thing is about migrants telling their own stories and the people around them who are working on it. And then the last one I'll tell you about is this. It's called Priya Shakthi. So this is in 2012 was a really difficult year. There was a rape in New Delhi on a bus. And it sort of, people around the world heard about it. It was a woman named Jyoti Singh who was gang raped and then 3 days later ended up dying from the wounds. And what it did was it sparked nationwide protests in India. Now, India has a very rich and vibrant sort of feminist sector. It has a rich and vibrant civil society sector, and they've been working, for decades on issues of gender-based violence. But this case itself was sort of so horrific and it was so, I guess, relatable to a lot of people that it sparked these national protests. And a filmmaker named Ram Devineni was there doing another film and ended up filming the protests. And he and I had worked together before, and he came back, he's like, I want to work on this issue. I want to start thinking about how you start pushing against the narrative of shame and the narrative of patriarchy in India. Now, India is not the only country that has a gender-based violence problem. The entire world does. And I was very honored today to meet with someone who works with the feminist MEDIAMORFOSIS, no? Yeah. With that movement. So we talked quite a bit about what's happening in Argentina in terms of gender-based violence with women. But India was having, there were so many cases that were being talked about. So what we did was we came up with Ram and an artist named Dan Goldman and then a poet named Vikas Menon. The 4 of us together put together this augmented reality comic book that creates Priya, who is a fictional character. She's a comic book character, and she's a superhero. She herself is a survivor of a gang rape, and she starts pushing against patriarchy, pushing against these norms by using song and love, right? She gathers community, and that's her superpower. So do we have time to show the, okay. I'm gonna just show you a little bit of a little bit of a trailer. So the core piece of content is this comic book that you can download for free from the website, from Priya Shakthi. We also did print copies for children in India who didn't have access to technology. And then all the pieces are enabled with AR, with augmented reality, that gives you extra content. And what you also get is the stories, you can hear the stories of survivors themselves. Under Indian law, you cannot disclose the identity of a rape victim unless she herself chooses to do so, or he. And so what we did was we animated their stories, and it's sometimes their voices, it's sometimes an actress, voicing over, but you hear their own story. So again, it was the people's own story that becomes the engine of change. And this ended up sort of going around the world. They're on their third volume now. So this is the first volume. The second one's about acid attack. The third one's about human trafficking. So there's going to be 5 volumes in total, aiming at specific kinds of gender-based violence. So just in terms of takeaways, what we try to do is make sure that we're working with community-centered participation. It's always their stories that inform what we do. We're just the avenue, we're the channel, right? It's always the stories from the communities. We're trying to move beyond awareness. We use platforms that are culturally appropriate, like making sure that we're talking to people in country or in the region and understanding what people's needs are and then delivering that. And in terms of women's rights in particular, women's issues in particular, what I hope, often when we talk about women's rights, we're almost always talking about either the disparity in pay or gender-based violence or something. Women's issues cut across every single issue, and that's what we're trying to show with some of our work. So I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Gracias, Lina. Thank you. Bueno, tengo muchas preguntas para Lina. Gracias, Lina.
Thank you, Lina. It is very interesting to see how professional work techniques can be used for different purposes. And it is also very interesting to see how you use these tools for gender issues. I am interested in asking about your work in these projects. So you work with directors. You are not the project director, you are the producer. So what is your role in the development of the transmedia strategy? To take any of the examples that you mentioned.
So primarily what I'm doing and what we do in my company is we're producing the content, we're not directing. Often we will direct some of it in terms of making sure that it's appropriate to the culture, appropriate, that it's not poverty porn and things like that. So we will direct those aspects of it. But primarily we're producing. And we're also always doing the social impact strategy. So before a piece of content is produced or before a platform is produced, we are making sure that we are thinking very strategically about the social impact that we can have and that we're going to have. And then we document that impact as well. So we're working with NGOs, networks of NGOs that are working on the core issue, and we make sure that the content is useful to them, that they know how to use it, that we distribute it to the right audiences. So we do some distribution work as well, and making sure that we're engaging stakeholders on the particular issues in the right questions and in the right solutions. So that's also that's producing and strategy.
Bien, hay preguntas para Lina. Yo tengo.
Are there any questions for Lina? I have another question. It is interesting to see that the way you measure the success of social work is different from measuring success in a business where you have to monetize. So you measure success in terms of impact. So let's...
Hi, Lina, how are you?
Hi.
I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with political barriers? I mean, in the governments or the people involved that don't like the work you're doing or it's not beneficial for them. How do you deal with that? I think it's very exhausting, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're always making sure that we're aligned with any particular NGO sector within a country. So we're always working with the cover of the NGO sector. I do very little work with governments, except for sometimes I do work with our State Department, at least the progressive ones in the State Department, less and less so now. But we want to make sure that we're not necessarily going up against any particular government. We want to make sure, like I'm coming from America, right? I'm coming from New York, so there's an inherent protection that I have just from that. So if I'm going, like for example, I was speaking in Uganda a couple of months ago, and at my talk, they said, we want to warn you that there are people from the government who are placed here, and they're seeing who's going to be in your talk. Like they're monitoring this. So I have to make sure that I am protecting the people that I'm working with, that I'm protecting the people who show up as much as possible. But really, it's about being as sensitive as possible to the needs of the people in the community and sensitive to the needs of the NGO sector. But I'm always partnering with the NGO sector. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Bien, la siguiente.
Hello. Next one.
Hi, Lina, how are you? Here.
Hi.
I want to ask you about if you can give us the key drivers, if I want to create content with social impact, how can I do it?
Yeah.
And the second question is about how you work with, how you develop the content with, the funds that you have to find to produce that kind of things, and how you get it.
Okay, so to the first thing, like how do you actually make social impact using this work? So on my website, I think you can't see it, but on my website I have a set of free tools that anybody can take and use, and it helps you plan how to use your content, not to develop the content, but how to use the content in terms of engaging the right audiences and creating the right partnerships, and then really understanding how you can create very particular pieces of very particular change. My theory is that the more granular you are, the more specific you are, and the smaller in scope your impact is, the more successful you're going to be. I do believe in systems change, but I believe that if you say, well, I want to attack climate change, you're not going to be successful. If you're talking about working with the community on questions of water and pesticides, that's going to be a little more specific, that you're going to do better. So there are a couple of tools on my website that anybody can have that allows you to map out your strategy by yourself. And then in terms of, back to your question, like how do you measure that? Social change using culture, social change using story, one, is very hard to measure. Like you have to be a little bit, I think, humble when you do this kind of work, that you're just contributing. There's no way to say, well, I did that, right? When you're using story. There's no way to say, well, I'm the one, sort of who caused this change. It is a group effort. It's always a collective effort, and the only way to make change is to be patient and to sort of, make sure that you are contributing to a movement at any given point that you are asked to do so, right? So I think of myself in service of, like we're a service organization. Like if we're leaders, we're servant leaders, right? We're serving a larger movement. In terms of funding, the United States has a fairly vibrant philanthropic sector. We don't get state funding for most things, which is good and bad. So the way we finance our work and the way we finance these projects is through grants from foundations. Often I'll get a grant from a foundation when they say, they'll say, we want you to work on X issue. Or if I'm working with, so we work with media, probably less than half of our work. The other is client work and working with agencies. So we will get paid by clients, we'll get paid by agencies to do a particular set of pieces, and we produce those and develop those. But primarily it's philanthropic funding.
Muchas gracias, Lina. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, sir.